In this video, we will write our first CSS code. We will use CSS to add color and a little bit of formatting to an existing HTML page. To begin working in CSS, you're going to need two things, the first of which is a text editor. Here I'm working in Notepad++, a free source text editor which I downloaded from notepad-plus-plus.org. I like this editor because it's minimal but does support syntax highlighting for both HTML and CSS. In reality, any text editor will do, but you do want to stay away from word processors like Microsoft Word or OpenOffice Writer. These programs will add formatting and versioning information to the text you create that will confuse web browsers when they attempt to interpret your code. The second thing you're going to need to write and test CSS is a web browser. Let's take a look at this page in a web browser right now. Here's the file we were just working with. I've called it helloworld.html. Don't be concerned if your HTML files have a different icon than this. Generally, your operating system will choose your default web browser as the icon for HTML files. It's probably important to note here that you should be testing your HTML and CSS pages in every web browser you think an end user might employ. This is because there can be slight differences between the way that web browsers interpret the code, and you certainly want to be aware of this before someone stumbles onto your page using a web browser that you don't support. Right now I'm going to open the page up in Google Chrome. You can use whatever web browser you'd like. The page should look the same. So here's our unstyled HTML page. It really is just two elements, a H1 header element and a P or paragraph element reading "Hello World!" ! It's a nice HTML Hello World page, but we can certainly add some pizzazz. So let's go back to our editor. There are a number of different ways to style an HTML page. What we're going to do here is insert CSS directly into the page's header. And we do this with the HTML style tag. This section right here is where we'll be adding our new CSS code. There's one more thing we need to do first, though, and that's to tell the browser interpreting this page what kind of styling language we're using, in our case CSS. That's the type attribute, and we tell it text/CSS. Now we can begin styling between the style tag that we've just created. It's finally time to write our first CSS rule, and that's what style sheets are. They're a series of rules which persist throughout the pages that they modify. Each CSS rule has three parts, the first of which is who is this rule going to affect. I think we should start modifying our page with the header element. So let's tell our browser that we're going to state a rule to affect all H1 elements. And that's the syntax for a general rule, just the name of the element that we'd like to write the rule for, and then some brackets between which we can write our CSS code. In this case, we'd like to modify the color of all H1 elements, and this CSS attribute is simply called color. After an attribute, we put a colon, and here comes the third portion of the CSS rule, the value we'd like to assign. In this case, let's just change the color to red. Before our styling will show up on our page, we need to, of course, save the file. And then, rather than opening a new browser or new browser tab, let's just refresh the helloworld.html page. And now we can see that the header has turned red. Back to our code, a CSS rule can modify more than one attribute. So in addition to changing the color of headers on our page, let's center them so they're not off to the left. This rule is text align, and we're just going to give it the value center. While we're at it, we should probably style the main text of the page. So here's the rule for all of our P elements. What I'd like to do is color these elements purple. But I'm going to show you a more robust way to declare colors in CSS rather than picking from their list of predefined ones. We're going to use the RGB function, which lets us declare a color dynamically. It takes three parameters: the amount of red in the color, the amount of green in the color, and the amount of blue in the color. These are integer values. The minimum is 0 for none of this in the color, and the maximum is 255 for as much red, green, or blue as you can have in the color. So purple is going to be 255, 0, 255, equal parts red and blue. You may also see colors represented as hex values. This is a base 16 number in which the first two characters stand for the amount of red, the second two the amount of green, and the last two the amount of blue. Just like our RGB function. It's a little less human readable, but the equivalent of 255 is FF. So there's purple in hexadecimal notation. The hex system of color notation really doesn't get any points for human readability. So this might be a good time for me to add a comment to my page. Comments are bits of text that we explicitly tell the web browser to ignore when parsing our code. By placing the word purple between these \* brackets, we designate that it's not part of the code, it's just there for developer reference. It's important to note that HTML and CSS use different comments. If I try to use the \* brackets in the HTML portion of my page, the words and the brackets will appear. I'd like to do two more things before we head to our web browser and admire the colorful page we've created. The first of these is to modify the background of our page. In order to do that, we're going to need to access the body element directly. And our rule is going to affect its background color. I'd like the background color to be a light gray. In the RGB sense of color, gray is a color that has the same amount of red, green, and blue. The color 000 is black, and the color 255, 255, 255 is white. So to get a light gray, let's go with 200, 200, 200. The last thing I'd like to address, as you've probably noticed, is that we have two rules for the color of P elements. We can learn a little bit about CSS here by modifying one of these rules slightly. Let's change our first rule from purple to be defining blue as the color. Now go ahead and place your bets as we head to the web browser. What color do you think our Hello World text will be? Don't forget to save first. Here is our wonderfully styled web page. I certainly wouldn't suggest that you ever use red, purple, and gray as a page's color scheme, but we have modified its appearance for sure. Also, our Hello World text is purple. If you'll remember, purple is the second rule we declared. This is our first introduction to the cascade of cascading style sheets. What this means is that CSS gives preference to rules that are more specific or have been declared after a previous rule. If we were to switch our purple and blue rules, the p text would now be blue.